We're living in an era where up is down, heroes are villains, and if you save a train full of terrified people from a violent threat, you don't get a handshake. You get handcuffs. This isn't just American institutions hitting a rough patch. It's Democrats weaponizing them like a sledgehammer, bashing away at anyone who stands in the way of their woke revolution. They're not fixing the system. They're breaking it, one absurd decision at a time. Now here's a kicker. The same crowd demanding Daniel Penny's head on a platter for defending a train full of innocent people is out here practically throwing a parade for the guy who assassinated a CEO of United Health. A husband and father gunned down because he ran an insurance company with policies that, let's be honest, were shaped by the very red tape Democrats wrapped around the industry under Obamacare. I guess saving lives gets you a trial, but taking lives gets you trending on Lefty X. But here's a question you need to ask yourself. What does this relentless overreach mean for you, your family, your future? Are you safer? Are you thriving? Or are you just trying to survive while the cost of everything skyrockets and trust in leadership hits rock bottom? A recent Pew Research study found that only 20% of Americans trust the government to do what's right. 20%. That's the kind of approval rating that would make even Nickelback fans cringe. This isn't just political theater, folks. It's your wallet getting lighter and lighter, your healthcare getting worse, and the justice system being treated like a political toy. And what's been clearer than ever is that Democrats aren't solving problems. They're creating the chaos. They're out of step, out of ideas, and out of touch with reality, pushing their agenda while regular Americans pay the price. So let's break all this down, starting with the Daniel Penny case, where the left's obsession with rewriting right and wrong is on full absurd display. This comes courtesy of Mario Nawful on X. Breaking manslaughter charge dropped in Daniel Penny case. The jury in Daniel Penny's trial remains deadlocked on the second-degree manslaughter charge, prompting the state to dismiss it after 4 days of deliberations. Prosecutors are moving forward with a negligent homicide charge, but the judge is reportedly apprehensive about continuing at this point. A recess has been called with proceedings set to resume. Inner City Press on X got great coverage of what happened next. In the courtroom, he says, Daniel Penny and his lawyers come in. Judge Wiley, what do the people want? ADA Yaron responds, we'd like to dismiss count 1. Please let ADA Stephen Yu, our appeals chief, speak. The judge then says it may not be necessary. Dismissing the first count would resolve the compromise verdict issue. Penny's lawyer, Kenneth, responds, this would be elbowing the jury, coercing them. Judge Wiley responds, the DA's proposal would resolve that. ADA Wu says, Your Honor, put it correctly, removal of the top count with prejudice takes that concern away. Judge Wiley responds, what do I tell the jury? ADA Yaron says, don't tell them it's an acquittal on count 1, only that it's dismissed. Penny's lawyer, Kenneth, responds again saying, this has never been done before. It would encourage prosecutors to overcharge in the grand jury with the option of withdrawing if hung under coercion. Judge Wiley responds to that saying, I'll take a chance and grant the people's application. I'm going to let them go to return and consider count 2 on Monday. Bring them in. Jury entering is announced. The judge then says, manslaughter in the second degree is dismissed. You are free to consider count 2 on Monday. What we just read is unequivocally alarming because it's not just simple legal procedure. It's a masterclass in judicial overreach, prosecutorial gamesmanship, and outright manipulation of the system. And every American should be paying attention. Here's why. First, it's judicial overreach and coercion. By dismissing the manslaughter charge with prejudice, meaning it can never be brought back, the judge removes a key option the jury might have been struggling with. Normally, if a jury can't decide, it's allowed to deadlock. That's how the system works. But instead of letting the jury deliberate freely, the judge essentially narrows the choices. Now the jurors are left staring at the only remaining charge, criminally negligent homicide, which has a lower burden of proof. It's like giving someone a multiple choice test, but the only answer you leave on the page is B. Penny's lawyer is right to call this elbowing the jury. It's subtle, but it pressures the jurors into thinking they have to convict on count 2 because there's nothing else on the table. That's not justice. It's psychological coercion. Then there's the prosecutorial strategy. Prosecutors have been pulling this trick for years, overcharging defendants with heavier counts during the grand jury phase. Why? Well, because it looks intimidating and makes the defendant more likely to accept a plea deal. But here's a kicker. If the jury hangs on a big charge, prosecutors can withdraw or dismiss it mid-trial and push the jury toward a compromise verdict on a lesser charge. It's legal, but it's manipulative. It stacks the deck against defendants and turns the courtroom into a rigged casino, where the House, meaning the state, always wins. Penny's lawyer called this out perfectly, warning that it sets a dangerous precedent. Prosecutors can overcharge whenever they want, then retreat and settle without without ever proving the top charge was legitimate. Now, to take this a step further and consider the optics and the integrity in this case, the assistant district attorney explicitly asked the judge not to tell the jury that the manslaughter charge is effectively an acquittal. Think about that. The prosecution doesn't want the jury to know they couldn't prove their case. Instead, they want the dismissal to look like a neutral procedural decision, just some courtroom housekeeping, while they quietly nudge the jury toward convicting on the lesser charge. Why? Because admitting they failed would undermine their case. The prosecution wants to keep appearances while moving the goalposts mid-game. It's manipulation, and it erodes trust in the legal process. Which brings us to judicial influence. Judges are supposed to be neutral referees in the courtroom. Their job is to ensure fairness, not to help one side maneuver the jury. But in this case, the judge is granting the prosecution's request to dismiss a charge in a way that benefits the state. Whether intentional or not, it looks like the judge and the prosecution are on the same team. This is where things get dangerous. When jurors see the judge subtly steering the process, it can influence their decisions, even if they don't realize it. Finally, we have to ask, why not just acquit? If the evidence for manslaughter wasn't strong enough, why not acquit Penny outright? That would be the honest, just outcome. An acquittal would tell the jury and the public that the prosecution couldn't meet the burden of proof. But no, they chose to dismiss instead. Why? Because an acquittal looks like failure. By dismissing the charge, the assistant district attorney avoids admitting defeat while keeping the jury focused on convicting Penny for something, anything really, just to secure a win. With all that being said, here's a bigger picture. This trial is not actually about justice. It's about a system being weaponized to fit a political narrative. With Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, a Democrat, overseeing this prosecution, the fingertips of partisan influence are hard to ignore. This isn't about fairness, evidence, or the truth. It's about punishing a man who dared to act where their policies failed and scoring ideological points in the process. Whether or not every player in this case wears the same partisan badge, the outcome serves the broader agenda of the left-leaning establishment, willing to twist the system to serve its goals. And when the rules get bent this far for political ends, it's only a matter of time before they come for you too. And in case you're not convinced that this subversion of justice is the result of Marxist activists infiltrated in our justice system, here's a video of Daphne Yaron, prosecutor in Penny's case, explaining her ethics herself.
So I'm going to give you an example of something that I did with a recent case of mine, and this has never been done in my office. I had a murder case where the defendant did not intentionally kill the victim. He went into an ATM on the Upper West Side and tried to rob an individual. Unfortunately, it was an older individual. He was 86. And in the course of the robbery, he fell to the ground, and as a result, he died. This is, under the law, a felony murder, which is akin to intentional murder. However, when I first got the case, I learned, I took the time to learn about the defendant, and it was a strong case. So it wasn't about a whodunit. I knew immediately who did it. I could prove it. I could take it to trial that day and win it. But it wasn't about that. It was that the more I learned about the defendant and his life and the circumstances, the kinds of things that Jarrell was talking about, that one should take into account the trauma of that individual, I really felt incredibly sorry for him that he had gotten to that point in his life where he felt like there was no other choice but to commit this robbery.
This clip of Assistant District Attorney Daphne Yaron tells us everything we need to know, not just about the Daniel Penny case, but about the ideological rot infecting our justice system. Here we have Daphne on full display, bragging about a case where she prosecuted someone for felony murder, but decided to take their trauma into account. Let's not sugarcoat this. She showed compassion for the criminal, not the victim or their grieving family. The defendant, who robbed an 86-year-old man and caused his death, got a reduced sentence of 10 years instead of facing the full weight of the law. Why? Because Daphne decided to play therapist, felt incredibly sorry for him, and facilitated a restorative justice program. And she didn't mention this, but I looked it up. As part of that restorative justice program, the victim's family was approached and asked if they would participate in a mediated sit-down with a man responsible for their loved one's death. Now, while the family ultimately agreed to participate, calling it therapeutic, let's not gloss over the insanity of the situation. Imagine the position they were put in. You lose your father, your grandfather, forever. And instead of seeing justice done, you're offered an emotional reconciliation meeting as part of a reduced sentence deal. Sure, it wasn't mandatory, but can you blame a grieving family for thinking this was their only way to find closure when the justice system clearly wasn't interested in holding the killer fully accountable? Now, here's a hard truth about restorative justice. It sounds good on paper, but in practice, it often turns the justice system into a therapy session for criminals while victims and their families are left to suffer in silence. Proponents love to tout their glowing headlines about reduced recidivism rates and higher victim satisfaction. But according to a meta-analysis of 24 studies published by restorativejustice.org, those claims are inconsistent at best. While some programs show promise, their effectiveness varies wildly depending on the type of offense and how the program is implemented. In other words, restorative justice is not a one-size-fits-all solution, and no amount of feel-good rhetoric can change that. But the real kicker is the impact on the victims. A 2022 study published by Safe Journalists found that while some victims report feeling empowered, others experience increased anxiety and trauma when forced to face their offenders. Imagine sitting in a room, staring at the person who destroyed your life, and being told this is progress. That's not justice. That's psychological torture wrapped up in buzzwords. And when you reduce sentences for violent crimes like the death of an 86-year-old man during a robbery, what are you really restoring? Nothing. You're teaching criminals that if they frame their actions as a result of their struggles, the system will pity them and hand out lighter punishments. This is clearly not compassion. It's insanity wrapped in a feel-good bow. The criminal gets sympathy, a lighter sentence, and a shot of redemption while the victim's family is left to pick up the pieces. What message does that send out? That the system cares more about the offender's trauma than justice for the victim? That the victim's suffering matters less than the criminal's second chance? How does reducing a 25 to life sentence to only 10 years for causing an innocent man's death restore anything? It doesn't. It undermines the entire point of justice, holding people accountable for their actions. Now let's compare this to Daniel Penny. Penny steps up in a moment of chaos on a subway where a man with 42 prior arrests and an open warrant was threatening passengers. Penny restrained him, not to kill him, but to protect those around him. Now Penny is being dragged through the courts, vilified, and treated like a criminal for defending people who couldn't defend themselves. But the man who shoved an elderly victim to their death during a robbery, well, he gets Daphne's deep sympathy and a pass on harsh punishment. Overall, the double standards here are laughable. According to Yoron's logic, the defendant in her felony murder case was a victim of trauma, and therefore his actions were understandable. I guess the trauma of the 86-year-old victim or his family wasn't as compelling. But when it comes to Daniel Penny, a Marine who acted out of instinct to protect innocent lives, suddenly compassion goes completely out the window. No questions about Penny's background, no time taken to learn about him, no room for understanding his intentions. Why? Because Penny doesn't fit the left's narrative? Penny represents accountability and courage, two concepts the woke justice system despises because they expose its failures. And here's where the rhetorical tricks kick in. Listen carefully to Daphne's speech. It wasn't about who did it. I could take it to trial that day and win. She says this with pride, as if justice is some artful balancing act where the law doesn't matter. Only her personal sense of fairness does. But justice isn't supposed to be subjective. It's not a feelings contest. The law exists to protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable. When prosecutors start prioritizing understanding trauma over enforcing the law, what happens? Chaos. You get a two-tiered justice system where violent offenders are painted as misunderstood victims and those who stand up to protect others, like Penny, are painted as villains. But this isn't just about Yoron. This is bigger than one prosecutor. This is about Democrats completely subverting the justice system to serve their ideological ends. The same activists who scream about equity and reform are the ones bending the law into pretzels to make heroes into criminals and criminals into martyrs. They love stories of trauma because it lets them sidestep personal responsibility. And when you start letting personal sob stories dictate outcomes instead of the law, you don't have justice. You have favoritism. Now let's take a moment to appreciate the irony here. The system failed Jordan Neely at every turn. He had dozens of arrests, violent outbursts, and an open warrant. He was a walking example of how our institutions are collapsing under the weight of compassionate non-enforcement policies. But instead of holding those policies or their champions accountable, the prosecution goes after Penny, the guy who stepped in where the system failed. That's the great irony here. The Democrats create a mess and then punish anyone who dares to clean it up. And Daphne Iran's words tell us everything we need to know. She's not interested in justice. She's interested in ideology. She has sympathy for criminals and none for those who take actions to defend others. This is what happens when activists infiltrate the justice system. They turn it into a theater of selective outrage. They let their feelings dictate the law, and they punish people like Daniel Penny to send a message. Don't stand up. Don't step in. Just let the chaos happen. And if you think this won't affect you, think again. What happens when the violent threat comes your way? What happens when you're put in a position to protect yourself or someone you love? If the left gets its way, you won't just face the threat. You'll face a courtroom that treats you like the real criminal. So here's the bottom line. The justice system isn't broken. It's being corrupted. People like Daphne Iran are redefining right and wrong to fit their worldview. And the result? Good men like Daniel Penny are prosecuted, while criminals are coddled. If that's not a subversion of justice, I don't know what is. Now, the ideological bias in this trial becomes harder to ignore when you look at the verdict sheet, which we have right here. The second paragraph addresses the exact situation we've seen play out in this courtroom, stating, if you find the defendant not guilty on count 1, manslaughter in the second degree, for the reason that the people have failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was not justified, then you must consider count 2, criminally negligent homicide, and you must also find the defendant not guilty on that count. While this instruction itself is standard legal procedure, it's hard to ignore how the prosecution and judge manipulated the process leading up to this point and ultimately circumvented the very guidance they laid out. The verdict sheet clearly states that if the jury finds Penny not guilty of manslaughter because his actions were justified, then they must also find him not guilty of the lesser charge of criminally negligent homicide. But what did the judge and the ADA do here? They dismissed the chop charge of manslaughter with prejudice, effectively yanking it off the table and avoiding allowing the jury to fully deliberate on Penny's justification. Instead of an acquittal, which would align with the instructions, the dismissal left the jury staring at only one remaining option, count 2, criminally negligent homicide. Thus, by dismissing rather than acquitting, the judge sidestepped the clean resolution the instructions demanded and subtly nudged the jury toward convicting on the lesser charge. Combine that with the ADA's earlier insistence that the jury not be told the dismissal amounted to an acquittal, and it becomes clear the process was manipulated to remove any room for a just outcome that favors Penny. If they had followed their own instructions, the jury would have been required to weigh Penny's justifications across both charges, not just the one left hanging after the prosecution's strategic retreat. Instead, the system was gamed to undermine Penny's defense while keeping the jury focused on convicting him at all costs. Now, this isn't just bias. It's a direct contradiction of the court's own instructions, a sleight of hand that turns a standard legal process into a weaponized tool for a determined outcome. Now, to explain a bit further the difference between the two charges, manslaughter requires proving that Penny acted recklessly, showing a conscious disregard for the risk of death. Negligent homicide is less severe. It requires showing carelessness or failure to act responsibly, a lower standard of proof. If convicted of negligent homicide, Penny faces a lighter sentence compared to manslaughter, which carries harsher penalties. However, this charge still holds serious consequences and keeps the focus on whether Penny's actions in Jordan Neely's death were avoidable. Now, in the midst of all this, there is some good news. House GOP Representative Eli Crane is introducing a resolution to award Penny the Congressional Gold Medal, which is the highest civilian honor granted by Congress, awarded to individuals or groups for exceptional acts of service or heroism. Now, while Daniel Penny is fighting for his life in a courtroom for an act of heroism, another situation in New York exposes the stark dichotomy currently playing out in American culture. On Wednesday, United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, husband and father, was brutally assassinated, shot in cold blood. While the exact motive remains unclear, sources told the New York Post that shell casings found at the scene were engraved with the words "deny, depose, and defend," a chilling reference to the 2010 book Delay, Deny, Defend, which criticizes the insurance industry for allegedly prioritizing profit over patient care. Now, instead of universally condemning the senseless act of violence, the left is treating it as some warped form of justice. Social media is already littered with unhinged commentary, cheers, jokes, and outright praise, framing the assassination as a righteous blow against corporate greed. But let's get one thing straight. This isn't justice. This was a cold-blooded murder. Notice the dynamic at play. A Marine like Daniel Penny is vilified for defending innocent lives, while the assassination of a businessman is twisted into an act of rebellion, celebrated as some righteous strike against corporate greed, simply because his role in the healthcare system makes him an easy scapegoat. This reaction from the left isn't just moral rot. It's a sickness spreading through our culture. When violence becomes virtue and murder becomes a message, the line between justice and anarchy doesn't just blur, it disappears entirely. And if you thought this cultural sickness was limited to anonymous accounts on social media, think again. It's being amplified by people with platforms, people who once called themselves journalists. Enter former journalist Taylor Lorenz, now openly broadcasting her rage-fueled rhetoric on Blue Sky. In one post, Lorenz writes, "If you watched a loved one die because an insurance conglomerate has denied their life-saving treatment as a cost-cutting measure, it's natural to wish that the people who run such conglomerates would suffer the same fate." To make sure you didn't miss the message, she even shared a link titled, "Yes, we want insurance executives dead." And later, when news broke that Blue Cross Blue Shield would no longer cover anesthesia for the full length of certain surgeries, Lorenz doubled down, responding, "And people wonder why we want these executives dead." As if that wasn't unhinged enough, she later shared a picture of the CEO of one of the major healthcare companies, essentially holding her up as a target. Now let's call this for what it is: the normalization of violent rhetoric from someone who used to claim the moral high ground. Lorenz isn't just expressing frustration with the healthcare system. She's stoking rage, directing it toward individuals and tacitly legitimizing violence. This isn't activism, it's recklessness. When you declare that we want executives dead and plaster their faces online, you're not fighting for justice, you're encouraging chaos. Lorenz's posts aren't just unprofessional and irresponsible, they're dangerous. And they lay bare the disturbing reality of what happens when ideology blinds people to basic human decency. And those posts weren't just isolated outbursts. Lorenz is also reposting others discussing sending threatening messages to CEOs with lines like, "You're next." Let that sink in for a moment. This isn't frustration with a system. It's a call to target individuals cloaked as righteous anger. But Lorenz isn't the only one on the left gleeful about all of this. If you want proof that this toxic mindset has spread far beyond social media, look no further than The View.
I mean, I was looking at some of the social media comments, and I try to stay away from social media, but it said some of the comments were thoughts and deductibles to the family. One of the comments was, "Unfortunately, my condolences are out of network." And so I think it really, isn't that something? I really think it's reflective about how people are feeling about their health care. And if you look at this particular CEO, while he made about $10 billion a year, which is not actually unusual for a CEO of a company this size, this particular health company, United Healthcare, is the largest company that's responsible for Medicare programs for people over the age of 65. And our country is one of the only countries that doesn't have universal health care, and we don't take care of our elderly, and people are feeling the pinch. We talk about that all the time, and I think people are really angry at the healthcare system, and so unfortunately it's translating to this father.
There's a lot there, so let's start out with this. Hostin's reference to Medicare, it's absolutely perplexing. Medicare primarily serves individuals over 65, yet available evidence suggests the alleged assassin is a young person. This incongruity indicates a superficial attempt to connect unrelated issues, undermining the coherence of her argument. Hostin then brings up the CEO's $10 million salary, but even she admits this level of compensation is common for executives of large corporations. So why mention it at all? Because it's an easy distraction. Demonizing a single individual's paycheck is far simpler than addressing the real systemic challenges plaguing the healthcare industry. The truth is, executive salaries have little to do with the struggles patients face. Those problems, skyrocketing costs, limited access, and denied claims, are largely the result of government interference, overregulation, and policies like Obamacare that have strangled competition and innovation. By fixating on CEO pay, Hostin avoids confronting the role of government policies in creating the very frustrating she claims to care about. The Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare, introduced regulations that have significantly impacted the insurance industry. For instance, the ACA imposed medical loss ratio requirements, mandating that insurers spend a certain percentage of premiums on medical claims and healthcare quality improvements. While intended to ensure value for consumers, these regulations have led to increased administrative burdens and financial strain on insurers. According to the Heritage Foundation, Obamacare more than doubled health insurance costs for workers and families, with a national average premium increasing by 129% from 2013 to 2019. Now, you have to look no further than California, where I live. It serves as a prime example of the detrimental effects of overregulation and the sheer irony of government intervention. The state's stringent policies, imposing unsustainable price controls, excessive coverage mandates, and regulatory hurdles, have driven major insurers like State Farm and Allstate completely out of the market. As Newsweek reports, these insurers have stopped accepting new applications for property insurance in California, citing the impossible balance for regulatory challenges and increasing wildfire risks. And here's where the irony kicks in. The very government that overregulated the private insurance market to death now swoops in with its own solution: the FAIR Plan, a government-run insurance program touted as a last resort. But here's a catch. The FAIR Plan is riddled with inefficiencies, high costs, and limited coverage, all while failing to address the core problems it was meant to solve. Instead of fixing the market, the government effectively monopolized it, creating a need for the service by destroying private competition in the first place. Think about how absurd that is. The government ties the hands of private companies, forces them out, and then says, hey, don't worry, we'll step right in and save you. This is the equivalent of lighting your house on fire and then handing you the garden hose. And it doesn't stop there. It never does. By stepping in to fill the gap they created, the government grows larger, more bloated, and even less efficient. The FAIR Plan's delays, administrative mismanagement, and unsustainable costs have only exacerbated the crisis. Yet instead of recognizing that overregulation caused the problem, California's leadership doubles down, insisting that the government should have even more control. It's a vicious cycle. Regulation destroys the market, government steps in, and consumers are left with fewer choices, worse service, and higher costs. Now, going back to Sunny, her call for universal health care as a panacea overlooks the complexities of the issue. Government-run healthcare systems often grapple with inefficiencies, long wait times, and limited patient choice. Take California's Medi-Cal program, for example. Despite achieving near universal coverage, more than half of residents still struggle to afford healthcare services. In its 2024 survey, the California Healthcare Foundation reported that many Californians face difficulties accessing care due to high costs, long delays, and limited provider availability, leaving families insured on paper but underserved in practice. Massachusetts, often held up as a success story for universal health care, faces similar problems. In a 2024 report, Massachusetts Attorney General's office found that many insured residents are still burdened with rising medical debt and unmet health care needs. The report highlights a clear disconnect. Universal coverage does not automatically guarantee affordability or access to care. Even in a state with government-mandated health care, residents are left struggling to navigate a system that promises much but delivers little. A deeper issue lies in the administrative complexity of these government-run systems. In a study published by JAMA Health Forum earlier this year, researchers emphasized that the sheer bureaucracy of U.S. healthcare, made worse by government intervention, creates barriers to care, delays treatments, and increases costs. Adding more layers of regulation and control doesn't simplify the system, it makes it more inefficient and inaccessible. All of this highlights how the left's approach consistently involves creating problems through overregulation and then proposing government solutions that further erode individual freedoms. They stifle private markets, cripple innovation, and leave individuals with fewer choices and worse outcomes, all while expanding the reach of government power. This cycle doesn't address the root causes of issues. Instead, it compounds them, forcing people to rely on inefficient, bloated systems that promise solutions but deliver failures. Anyway, Hassan Piker, the internet's favorite trust fund Marxist, is back with another deranged take, writing, I was shocked by the positive reactions to the assassination of the healthcare CEO. If the authorities catch the hot hitman and the public hears his testimony and motive, I suspect the Shinzo Abe hit will become the second most successful political assassination in my timeline. Let's cut through the nonsense. Hassan isn't shocked. He's being facetious. This isn't commentary. It's him romanticizing cold-blooded murder and dressing it up as some edgy political statement. First, calling the assassin a hot hitman exposes exactly what Hassan is doing, glamorizing the killer and turning this tragedy into a glorified rebellion narrative. It's sick, it's irresponsible, and it turns real violence, someone's husband and father being murdered in the street, into entertainment for his audience. Hassan isn't outraged at the reaction, he's reveling in it, amplifying the twisted idea that murder can be a righteous act if the target fits the left's preferred list of villains. And then there's his bizarre comparison to Shinzo Abe's assassination, a horrific, deeply personal tragedy that had nothing to do with political uprising or systemic grievances. By invoking it here, Hassan tries to elevate the murder of a CEO to some grand ideological victory, framing it as the second most successful political assassination. Successful? What exactly is successful about leaving a grieving family behind or feeding into the growing culture of political violence? Nothing. But Hassan knows exactly what he's doing, planting the idea that this was not a senseless killing, but a necessary act of justice. Here's the truth Hassan won't admit. The frustrations people feel toward the healthcare system are real, but CEOs aren't the cause of those problems. Government intervention, endless regulations, and policies like Obamacare have strangled competition, driving up costs and leaving patients with fewer options and worse care. The California Healthcare Foundation reports that over half of Californians, I said this just a minute ago, despite universal healthcare coverage under Medi-Cal, still can't afford healthcare costs or access to providers. This isn't a failure of capitalism. It's a result of the heavy hand of government breaking what worked and replacing it with inefficiency. But Hassan doesn't care about solutions. He thrives on destruction. His entire shtick is finding scapegoats, CEOs, corporations, the rich, and cheering on chaos when people act out on the resentment he and others cultivate. It's not about fixing healthcare, it's about burning everything down and pretending it's progress. When you start celebrating assassinations as political success, you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. This isn't justice, Hassan, it's moral rot, and you're happily spreading it. Here's the bottom line. What kind of society are we becoming when defending innocent lives makes you a villain, but cold-blooded murder is treated like a righteous act? How do we get to a point where anger and resentment are celebrated as justice? Who does this chaos really help? It's not the people struggling with healthcare. It's not the families left grieving. It's the ideologues who thrive on division, destruction, and rage. So ask yourself, is this the future we want? A culture where violence is excused, villains are celebrated, and anyone who dares to stand up is torn down? This isn't progress. It's moral decay. And if we don't call it out right now, what comes next? You. Anyway, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Have a terrific day. Peace.